Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about intelligence testing, which I think is a very relevant topic to talk about actually, because although we don't have that much IQ testing that's used nowadays, we do have a lot of standardized testing, things like the ACT, the SAT, and while that may not be the same thing as an intelligence test, if you're studying the history of how standardized tests came to be, you're really studying intelligence testing. It kind of came from this idea that we can design a test to specifically examine someone's ability in a certain domain. So normally I would do kind of a participation type thing where I would ask you guys about some of your perceptions of intelligence tests. Obviously, I can't do that right now. But you can imagine if you were just to ask people out in the street, you'd get all sorts of answers. But generally, what are some of the most common issues about intelligence testing? What are problems that need to be addressed? One of them is bias, socioeconomic bias, which I'm going to talk about later on, and also English language bias, or whatever language the test is in. You can imagine if you were an English language learner who maybe had a pretty good command of the language, but you weren't perfect. You didn't. There were like some vocabulary that you didn't know because it's your second language. And so then you had a math problem that was a story problem, and some of the vocabulary that was a main part of the problem you didn't know. And so you would do poorly on that item, but it would be because of your English ability, not your math ability. But the problem was trying to test your math ability. So that's a confounding variable. It didn't test what it was supposed to test. And also, the format of it. So you typically think pencil and paper, like math problems, reading problems, which is typically how it's given. But a more creative person might be better able to do something that's involves their creativity. Thinking of alternative uses for an item. And so there's an argument as to whether there really are different intelligences, but nonetheless, a creative person would probably do better, at least in a different format, and pencil and paper wouldn't really allow them to reach their full potential. So here's kind of my roadmap. I'm going to be going through all these things, but I want to talk about, first of all, just military usage. That's how standardized tests, intelligence tests came to be. Basically, seeing whether people would reach a certain threshold to be fit to serve of intelligence is basically what that means. So now I'm going to talk about eugenics. Some of you might not know what this is. Some of you might know, but have no idea what it has to do with intelligence testing. It actually has a very dark history, which is part of why we really kind of don't use intelligence testing that much nowadays. We look down upon it. There's this guy, Francis Galton, who I believe was British, and he kind of founded this movement with this idea of using intelligence testing to identify a certain threshold. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but to say, certain people, if you're this intelligent, then good. But if you're not intelligent enough, then you should be marginalized in society, and you should not be allowed to reproduce, which is terrible. And I hope that you would be against that. But it did gather a lot of following in the late 1800s and early 1900s, based on the fact that people thought, well, we want our society to be as good as possible, and in order to have more advancement, we need to have people who are more intelligent. And so in order to do that, you need to kind of take the people who are less intelligent and eliminate them from the gene pool. Again, a terrible thing. But that was kind of a popular view at the time. And also with these intelligence tests, there were classifications. So we think of like things like you can be classified as a genius if your IQ is above, I think it varies what they consider that, but like 150, 130. But for like intelligence tests that Galton would be involved in, there would be classifications for being below average as well. We might think of terms as retarded, that's not a very good term to use, but they would even use terms like idiot and imbecile that we see as like just joking insults kind of, but they would be actual classifications. If your score was within a certain amount below average, you would be classified as an idiot. If it was even more below average, you'd be classified as an imbecile. And so these were actual technical terms that they use. So I think it's really interesting to hear to learn about the history of those terms, despite how terrible it might be. Gattaca, I also just wanted to mention that. That's a really cool movie. It also is very frightening in its implications, not horror, but It's basically eugenics logic, demonstrating what a society would look like where people with more impaired genes would be treated as marginalized in society. They would have less jobs open to them. I can't remember if they could reproduce or not, but they were very restricted in what they could do. And the people with better genes, through no achievement of their own, were treated as like royalty almost. So that's what eugenics is. So I want to talk about socioeconomic bias now. Class bias is, the same thing, but socioeconomic bias more specifically. And some of the types of problems that would be given in intelligence tests. Analogy problems were very common. Things like, historically, cup is to saucer as knife is to blank. And, you can imagine that's a good type of problem. It kind of assesses logical reasoning, but you can imagine, a lot of us probably don't know what a saucer is. It really is like, so if you have a teacup and that little plate under it is a saucer. Rich people might have a lot of those around their house, and so they know exactly what that is. But people who aren't as rich, or maybe even middle class people, they might have no idea what a saucer is. So they would score worse on that item, not based on the fact that they're less intelligent, but based on the fact that they don't, they just don't understand some of the content of the problem, which is not what the problem is trying to test. So another type of question that might be given in intelligence tests historically was a fill in the missing part of the picture. You might not be able to see this super well. I'm sorry about that. But basically, there's pictures, you have to fill in the missing parts. There's a whole lot of problems with this type of question. I don't know how to fill some of these in. But so like question 7, for example, is supposed to be a ping pong table, and you put the net there. That's the missing part. But you can imagine, we probably all know what a ping pong table is, but you can imagine before the internet, in the early 1900s, people who didn't have a ping pong table, how were they going to find out about that? They probably weren't. And so and that's associated with having less money, because probably you're not going to spend the money that you have on recreational things. You're going to spend it on necessities. Richer people might have things like ping pong tables, so they would answer that question correctly more based on the fact that they had privilege, not based on higher intelligence. So I had an example of modern intelligence testing. There was this one video we watched in AP Psych that was really good. It was about an intelligence test based on multiple intelligences. So they had people doing the pencil and paper, but they also had people doing alternative uses, like what are other uses for a sock? And then like they did a bodily kinesthetic, like a sports type thing. I forget exactly how it worked. But I could not find it. I couldn't find that video. But a good example, I think, of modern intelligence testing is the Raven's progressive matrices. This was talked about in your book. I'm not going to go over it again. Basically, if you don't still understand what it is, you can just read the picture. But I want to, this is a good test in some ways. We tend to demonize intelligence testing, say it's terrible. I generally agree, but this is a good test in some ways. First of all, it does not really have that socioeconomic bias. You could, you could argue maybe that richer people are more trained in pattern recognition because of more schooling, but there's not like cup and saucer here. That's just patterns. So there's nothing to really be familiar or not familiar with. Another thing that, it kind of has the weaknesses of all intelligence tests. It's a test. Someone could have a bad day. They might not just be that good at pencil and paper. They might be more verbal or just like demonstrating, showing the procedure of it. But I have actually given this test as a part of a class, as a part of a lab that I took as an undergrad. And people do not, this is hard. This problem is not that difficult. But it does take some time. But it's also called progressive because they get harder. So at first, people aren't getting 0. They start out usually getting them right. But by the end, they're taking a really long time, like 10 minutes on each one, and may not be getting it right. So there's very little floor effect. People are getting some right, but there's very little ceiling effect too. They're not getting all of them right. So most people fall in the middle. It's not like an intelligence test where if you're just kind of good at it, you can get everything correct. These are hard problems. Yeah, so this is kind of a modern example. I kind of wanted to go over the pros and cons of it and talk about specifically like what might be good about it, what might not be so good about it. Um, but hopefully as a result of this presentation, you came to understand both the history of intelligence testing and how that relates to modern intelligence testing and modern standardized testing as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. And that is the end of this video.